David Thompson stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his corner office, watching the city buzz with life 40 stories below. His phone hadn't stopped ringing all morning, and 3 different investors were waiting to hear back from him about deals worth millions. At 38, he had everything most people dreamed of: a tech empire he'd built from nothing, houses in 3 different countries, and enough money to last several lifetimes. But success had come with a price he was only beginning to understand. His assistant knocked and entered with another stack of contracts. "The Beijing team is holding on line 2 and your lawyer needs 5 minutes before the 3 o'clock meeting," she said, placing the papers on his already cluttered desk. David nodded without looking up from his laptop screen. Numbers, projections, profit margins. This was the language he spoke fluently now. It was simpler than the language he struggled with at home. The drive back to his estate took 45 minutes through traffic, giving him time to mentally prepare for the transition from CEO to father. The iron gates opened automatically as his car approached, revealing the sprawling mansion that had been featured in architectural magazines twice. Perfectly manicured lawns stretched toward the main house, where warm lights glowed in the windows like something from a movie set. But David knew the truth behind those picture-perfect walls. He parked in the circular driveway and sat for a moment in the silence. Through the second-floor windows, he could see the soft glow from his daughter's room. Lily was up there, probably working with one of her many therapists or sitting quietly in her specialized chair, looking out at the same view he was seeing now from below. The front door opened to marble floors and crystal chandeliers, every surface polished to perfection by the housekeeping staff. Classical music played softly from hidden speakers, something his interior designer had suggested to create ambiance. But the house felt hollow despite all its expensive beauty. "Good evening, Mr. Thompson," called Mrs. Chen, the head housekeeper, as she emerged from the kitchen. "Lily finished her physical therapy session about an hour ago. She's having dinner upstairs with Rachel." Rachel was the evening nurse, one of 6 different caregivers who rotated through their schedule to provide round-the-clock care for his 12-year-old daughter. Each one was qualified, professional, and kind. Each one knew Lily's medical needs better than he did. "How was her day?" David asked, the same question he posed every evening. "Quiet as usual. She seemed a bit tired after her session, but her vitals are all good. Dr. Martinez called earlier. He wants to adjust her muscle relaxation therapy next week." David nodded, absorbing the medical update like he would a business report. Cerebral palsy had made Lily's life a series of appointments, treatments, and careful monitoring. Since his wife had passed away 3 years ago, he'd thrown himself into making sure Lily had the best of everything: the finest doctors, the most advanced equipment, the most qualified staff money could buy. What he hadn't figured out was how to simply be her father. He climbed the curved staircase, his footsteps muffled by thick carpet. Family portraits lined the walls, photos from happier times when his wife was alive and their house had felt like a home instead of a medical facility. In most of the pictures, Lily was much younger, before they'd fully understood the extent of her condition. Her smile had been easier then, more frequent. The hallway leading to Lily's room was wider than most people's living rooms, designed to accommodate wheelchairs and medical equipment. Soft lighting created a calming atmosphere, and the walls were painted in gentle pastels that some child psychologist had recommended. David paused outside Lily's door, gathering himself for the daily ritual that never got easier. He knocked softly and entered to find Rachel helping Lily with her dinner. His daughter sat in her adaptive chair, carefully managing small bites of food with Rachel's patient assistance. "Hey there, sweetheart," David said, crossing to plant a gentle kiss on Lily's forehead. She looked up at him with eyes that seemed far too wise for her age, the same green eyes her mother had. But while her face lit up slightly at seeing him, she remained quiet as she almost always did. "How's my girl today?" he asked, settling into the chair beside her. It was a question he knew wouldn't get a verbal answer. Lily's speech was limited, mostly sounds and expressions that only her regular caregivers had learned to interpret. Rachel smiled warmly. "She did really well in therapy today. Dr. Santos thinks her core strength is improving." She continued the update about exercises and progress markers while David nodded along, trying to match her enthusiasm for small victories he didn't fully understand. The room itself was a testament to his determination to give Lily everything she might need. Adaptive technology lined one wall, tablets and communication devices that could translate her limited movements into words. Exercise equipment designed specifically for her needs occupied another corner. Educational materials and sensory toys were organized on custom shelving. It was perfect in every clinical sense, and somehow completely wrong. After Rachel finished helping Lily with dinner and began preparing her evening medications, David found himself studying his daughter's face. She was beautiful, with delicate features and hair that caught the light like spun gold, but there was something in her expression that he couldn't quite read, a distance that went beyond her medical condition. "Would you like to read together?" he asked, reaching for one of the picture books on her nightstand. It was something they did most evenings, though he was never sure how much she enjoyed it, versus simply tolerating his presence. As he read about adventures in far-off places, David noticed how Lily's attention seemed to drift toward the window. Outside, the grounds were beautifully lit, showing off the expensive landscaping and water features. But he wondered if she was looking at the beauty or simply wishing she could be anywhere else. The reading session lasted 20 minutes, filled with his voice and her silence. When he finished, he kissed her forehead again and stood to leave. "Sleep well, sweetheart. I love you." Walking back down the hallway, David felt the familiar weight of inadequacy settling on his shoulders. He provided everything Lily needed medically and financially, but somehow he couldn't shake the feeling that he was failing her in ways that couldn't be measured in dollars or medical progress. His home office called to him, like it always did, a place where problems had solutions and success could be quantified. He had 3 more calls to make before the day was over, contracts to review and strategies to plan. The business world made sense in ways that fatherhood didn't. As he settled behind his desk and opened his laptop, the house fell into its usual evening quiet. Lily would be getting ready for bed upstairs under Rachel's care, following the same routine they'd maintained for months. Tomorrow would bring more therapy sessions, more medical consultations, and more of the careful, professional distance that had somehow become normal. But that night, as David worked late into the evening, he couldn't stop thinking about the look in Lily's eyes and the feeling that despite all his success, he was missing something crucial about the most important job he'd ever had. 3 weeks had passed since David last thought about anything other than work. The Henderson merger was falling apart. His biggest client was threatening to walk, and the board meeting scheduled for Friday was going to be brutal. He'd been staying at the office until nearly midnight every night, leaving before Lily woke up and returning after she'd gone to sleep. On Thursday afternoon, David sat in yet another conference room, watching his lawyers argue over contract details that seemed to change every 5 minutes. His phone buzzed constantly with updates from different departments, each message more urgent than the last. The Henderson deal alone was worth $40 million, but the other side kept moving the goalposts. "We need a decision on the intellectual property clause by 5 o'clock, his lead attorney was saying, shuffling through a stack of papers thick enough to use as a doorstop. "If we don't respond today, they're going to assume we're backing out." David rubbed his temples, feeling the familiar pressure of a headache building behind his eyes. This was the kind of day that used to excite him. High stakes, multiple moving parts, millions of dollars hanging in the balance. But lately, everything felt exhausting. His assistant appeared in the doorway holding up her phone. "The Henderson team just canceled," she announced. "Something about needing to review terms with their board. They want to reschedule for next week." The room fell silent. 6 hours of preparation, a team of lawyers billing by the minute, and now they had to wait another week for an answer that might still be no. "That's it," David said, standing up and grabbing his jacket. "I'm going home. We'll regroup on Monday." His team exchanged surprised glances. David Thompson didn't leave work early. He barely left work at all. But something about the wasted day and the endless waiting had drained his usual drive to push through everything. The drive home took him through parts of the city he rarely saw during daylight hours. School buses were dropping kids off at suburban houses where mothers waited with snacks and questions about homework. Teenagers walked in groups laughing about things only they understood. Normal families doing normal things that David had somehow forgotten how to do. When he pulled through the gates of his estate, the afternoon sun was still bright, casting long shadows across the perfectly maintained grounds. He'd never noticed how quiet everything was during the day. No landscaping crews working, No delivery trucks coming and going. Just peaceful silence that felt almost strange after the chaos of his office. David parked and stood for a moment in his driveway, appreciating the warmth of the sun on his face. When was the last time he'd been home while it was still light outside? When was the last time he'd seen Lily during the day, instead of just during those brief evening visits that felt more like obligation than connection? He was halfway to the front door when he heard it. Laughter. Not just any laughter, but the kind of pure, joyful sound that makes everyone around it smile without thinking. It was coming from inside the house, floating down from the second floor where Lily spent her days. David stopped walking. In the 3 years since his wife had died, he couldn't remember hearing laughter in their house. The staff was always professional and pleasant, but never loud or playful. Lily's various therapists maintained encouraging but measured tones designed to promote healing, rather than fun. This was different. This was the kind of laughter that belonged at birthday parties and playgrounds, not in the carefully controlled environment of his daughter's medical routine. The sound came again, mixed with music that definitely wasn't part of Lily's usual therapy playlist. Instead of the classical pieces or gentle nature sounds that Dr. Martinez had recommended, he could hear something with rhythm and energy, music that made you want to move. David quietly opened the front door and stood in his marble foyer, listening. The laughter was clearer now, and he could make out 2 voices, one that had to be Lily's, though it sounded more animated than he'd heard in years, and another voice he didn't immediately recognize. A woman was speaking in what sounded like Spanish mixed with English, her tone warm and encouraging. "That's perfect, little one. Feel how the music wants to move you." More laughter from Lily, followed by sounds David had never heard his daughter make. Excited little squeals and what might have been attempts at singing along to the music. He climbed the stairs slowly, each step bringing the sounds into sharper focus. The music was definitely Latin, something with guitars and drums that had an infectious energy. The woman's voice continued to encourage Lily in a mixture of languages, occasionally breaking into song herself. "Now we spin, yes? Slow and gentle, like a cloud dancing in the sky." David reached the top of the stairs and moved toward Lily's room, his businessman's mind trying to make sense of what he was hearing. None of Lily's regular caregivers spoke Spanish. Rachel had been scheduled to work today, but this definitely wasn't Rachel's voice. Mrs. Chen spoke Mandarin when she talked to her family on the phone, but never Spanish. As he got closer to Lily's room, he could hear his daughter making sounds he'd never heard before, not the careful, measured responses she gave during speech therapy, but spontaneous expressions of joy that seemed to bubble up from somewhere deep inside her. "Beautiful little dancer. Your mama must have loved music too, yes? I can see it in how you move." David froze outside Lily's door. Someone was talking about his wife who had indeed loved music and dancing, who used to put on salsa records and dance around their kitchen while cooking dinner, laughing when David tried clumsily to join her. How could this stranger possibly know that? The music swelled and Lily's laughter grew even more delighted. David heard what sounded like clapping, uneven and awkward but definitely enthusiastic. His daughter, who struggled to coordinate simple movements during her daily physical therapy, was apparently clapping along to music. He took a deep breath and moved closer to the doorway, staying just out of sight but positioning himself where he could see into the room. What he saw made him grip the door frame for support. The sterile medical atmosphere of Lily's room had been completely transformed. Colorful fabric hung from the ceiling like ribbons, creating a canopy of flowing color that moved gently in the air. The medical equipment had been carefully pushed to one side, creating an open space in the center of the room. And there, in the middle of that space, was his daughter. But not the quiet, still version of Lily he was used to seeing. This was a different child entirely, one with bright eyes and flushed cheeks, one whose face was lit up with pure happiness as she moved her arms in time with the music. She wasn't alone. A woman David had never seen before was kneeling beside Lily's wheelchair, helping guide her movements while moving herself in a gentle, flowing dance. The woman appeared to be in her 30s with kind eyes and an infectious smile that seemed to light up the entire room. "One more time, little star," the woman was saying. "Show me how the music makes you feel." And Lily, his quiet, reserved daughter who barely spoke and rarely smiled, threw her head back and laughed with such joy that David felt tears spring to his eyes. For the first time in years, his daughter looked truly alive. David couldn't move. He stood frozen in the doorway, watching a scene that challenged everything he thought he knew about his own daughter. The woman helping Lily dance had her back to him, her dark hair pulled into a loose bun with colorful ribbons woven through it. She wore simple jeans and a bright yellow shirt that seemed to glow under the soft lighting of the transformed room. But it wasn't the stranger that held David's attention, it was Lily. His daughter was sitting on the edge of her wheelchair, her feet touching the floor in a way that would have made her physical therapist nervous. The woman, whoever she was, had her hands gently supporting Lily's arms, helping her sway back and forth to the rhythm of the music. But Lily wasn't just following along passively. She was actively participating, her head moving side to side, her shoulders lifting and dropping in time with the beat. Feel how the music moves through your body. "Little bird," the woman said softly, her voice carrying a slight accent that David couldn't quite place. "From your toes all the way up to the top of your head. Let it carry you." Lily made a sound that David had never heard before, something between a giggle and a song, like she was trying to hum along with the melody. Her eyes were bright and focused in a way that reminded David of his wife during her happiest moments. The woman began to move more dramatically, still supporting Lily but adding gentle spins and arm movements that looked like they belonged in a professional dance studio. "Now we are birds flying over the ocean," she narrated, her voice full of warmth and imagination. "Feel the wind under our wings?" To David's amazement, Lily responded by lifting her arms higher, attempting to mimic the flowing movements. Her coordination wasn't perfect. Her cerebral palsy made smooth motion difficult, but her effort was unmistakable. She was trying, and more importantly, she was enjoying herself. "Yes, perfect, you are the most beautiful bird in the whole sky," the woman exclaimed, and Lily's face broke into a smile so wide that David felt his chest tighten with emotion. When was the last time he'd seen his daughter smile like that? When was the last time she'd looked so completely happy? The music shifted to something slower and more melodic, and the woman adjusted their movements accordingly. She began to help Lily stand, supporting her weight while allowing her feet to barely touch the ground. It was something David had seen physical therapists do during strength training, but this felt completely different. This wasn't about building muscle or improving balance. This was about joy. "We are floating on clouds now," the woman whispered, and they began to move in slow, gentle circles around the open space. "Soft white clouds that carry us wherever we want to go." Lily's head fell back slightly, her eyes closed, and for a moment she looked like she was actually floating. The expression on her face was one of pure peace and contentment. David realized he was holding his breath, afraid that any sound from him might break the spell of whatever magic was happening in that room. The woman continued to guide Lily through the slow dance, occasionally singing along with the music in Spanish. Her voice was sweet and clear, and even though David couldn't understand the words, he could feel the love and care in every note. This wasn't just someone doing a job. This was someone who genuinely cared about his daughter. As they moved, David noticed other changes in the room that he'd missed at first glance. The sterile white walls were now decorated with colorful paper flowers that looked handmade. A few small plants sat on the windowsill, adding life to a space that had always felt more like a hospital room than a child's bedroom. The harsh overhead lighting had been replaced with softer lamps that created a warm, cozy atmosphere. Someone had turned his daughter's medical facility into a place where a child might actually want to spend time. The song began to wind down, and the woman slowly helped Lily back into her wheelchair. But instead of the tired, passive posture David was used to seeing, Lily sat up straight, her hands moving slightly as if she was still feeling the rhythm of the music in her body. "That was beautiful dancing, little star," the woman said, kneeling down to be at eye level with Lily. "You have music in your soul, just like your mama must have had." Again, the reference to his wife. David felt a mix of curiosity and something else, maybe protectiveness, maybe just confusion, about how this stranger seemed to know things about his family. The woman reached over to turn off the music, and in the sudden quiet, Lily made another sound, a small vocalization that sounded almost like she was trying to say more. The woman smiled and gently touched Lily's cheek. "Tomorrow we dance again, yes? But now you need to rest those dancing feet." It was then that the woman turned to gather some of the fabric decorations, and David got his first clear look at her face. She appeared to be in her early 30s with kind brown eyes and a smile that seemed to light up her entire face. There was something about her that radiated warmth and energy, like she was the kind of person who made everyone around her feel better just by being there. She was clearly not one of Lily's regular caregivers. David knew all of them by sight, and he'd never seen this woman before in his life. So who was she, and what was she doing in his house dancing with his daughter? As if sensing his thoughts, the woman looked up and caught sight of him standing in the doorway. Her face immediately changed from relaxed and happy to startled and worried. She quickly stood up, her hands smoothing down her shirt as if she was suddenly conscious of her appearance. "Oh, Mr. Thompson," she said, her accent more noticeable now that she was nervous. I didn't know you were home." David still couldn't find his voice. He was processing too many things at once. The transformation of the room, the version of Lily he'd just witnessed, the obvious care this stranger had shown his daughter, and the fact that he had no idea who she was or how she'd ended up here. The woman took a step forward, then seemed to think better of it and stayed where she was. "I can explain," she said quickly. "I know this isn't, I wasn't supposed to," but David was looking at Lily, who had turned her wheelchair to face the doorway and was now looking directly at him. There was something different in her expression, a liveliness that hadn't been there during their quiet evening visits. She made a soft sound, and her hand moved slightly in what might have been a wave. For the first time in longer than he could remember, his daughter seemed genuinely happy to see him. "Who are you?" David finally managed to ask, his voice coming out rougher than he'd intended. The woman straightened her shoulders, and despite her obvious nervousness, she met his eyes directly. "My name is Carmen Santos," she said. "I work for your housekeeping service. I've been coming here for about 2 months." David tried to remember if Mrs. Chen had mentioned hiring additional help, but his mind was still reeling from what he'd just witnessed. "And you were dancing with my daughter because—" Carmen glanced at Lily, then back at David. "Because she was sad," she said simply. "And music. Music helps sadness go away." The silence in the room stretched on as David stared at Carmen, trying to process her simple answer. Because she was sad, and music helps sadness go away. It sounded so basic, yet it had accomplished something that months of expensive therapy sessions hadn't managed to do. "Sad?" David repeated, looking between Carmen and his daughter. "But Lily has everything she needs. The best doctors, the best equipment, trained professionals helping her every day." Carmen's expression softened, and she glanced at Lily before answering. "Sometimes what we need and what makes us happy are different things, Mr. Thompson." David felt a flash of irritation. This woman, whoever she was, had been in his house for 2 months without his knowledge, had transformed his daughter's room without permission, and now she was suggesting that he didn't understand what his own child needed. "I think there's been some confusion here," he said, his voice taking on the cold, professional tone he used in difficult business meetings. "Your housekeeping staff. Your job is to clean, not to provide therapy or entertainment for my daughter." As soon as the words left his mouth, David saw Lily's expression change. The brightness faded from her eyes, and she seemed to shrink back into her wheelchair. She made a small sound that could have been distress, and her hands began to fidget with the edge of her blanket. Carmen noticed immediately. She moved toward Lily, her voice gentle and soothing. "It's okay, little star. Everything is okay," but David wasn't done. 3 years of carefully controlled routines, medical schedules, and professional boundaries were being challenged by a housekeeper who thought she knew better than the experts he'd hired. "I need you to explain exactly what's been going on here," he continued. "How long have you been doing this? Who gave you permission to change my daughter's room? And why wasn't I informed about any of this?" Carmen's cheeks flushed, but she kept her voice steady. "No one gave me permission, Mr. Thompson. I know I should have asked first, but—" She paused, looking at Lily again. The first time I saw her, she was crying. Not because she was hurt or sick, but because she was lonely. And I couldn't walk away from that. Lonely? David's irritation was growing. "She's never alone. There's always someone with her. Nurses, therapists, teachers. How could she be lonely?" Carmen took a deep breath as if she was preparing to say something that might get her fired. "Being around people and being with people are not the same thing, Mr. Thompson. Lily doesn't need more professionals. She needs someone who sees her as a little girl, not as a patient." The words hit David like a physical blow. He opened his mouth to argue, to defend all the careful planning and expensive care he'd arranged for his daughter, but something in Carmen's eyes stopped him. There was no judgment there, no criticism of his efforts. Just sadness for a child who had everything except what she needed most. "You don't understand," David said, his voice quieter now but still defensive. "Lily has special needs. She requires medical care and structured therapy. This..." He gestured at the colorful decorations and the space that had been cleared for dancing. "This isn't helping her condition." "But it's helping her spirit," Carmen replied gently. "Look at her, Mr. Thompson, really look at her." David turned to his daughter, expecting to see the quiet, withdrawn child he'd grown accustomed to. But even though Lily had seemed to retreat when his voice had gotten sharp, there was still something different about her. Her posture was more alert, her eyes more alive than he'd seen them in months. "She moves when she hears music," Carmen continued. "Not because someone is teaching her exercises, but because the music makes her want to move. She smiles when we dance together. She tries to sing along. These are good things, yes?" David felt his anger wavering. Everything Carmen was describing sounded positive, but it also felt dangerous in a way he couldn't explain. What if she gets hurt? What if all this excitement causes a seizure or affects her muscle tension? Her doctors have very specific guidelines about stimulation and activity levels. Carmen nodded seriously. "I understand your worries. I have a nephew with cerebral palsy back in El Salvador. I know the challenges. But I also know that joy is medicine too. Not instead of real medicine, but along with it." This was the first personal information Carmen had shared, and it made David pause. She wasn't just some random housekeeper who had stumbled into his daughter's life. She had experience with children like Lily. "Your nephew," David began. "He's 15 now," Carmen said with a smile. "When he was Lily's age, his family was so worried about keeping him safe that they forgot to let him be a boy. It took years for them to learn that protecting him and loving him could be the same thing." David looked at his daughter again. Lily was watching their conversation with an intensity that surprised him. Usually when adults talked around her, she seemed to tune out, staring at the ceiling or out the window. But now she was focused on them, as if she understood that they were talking about something important to her. "How often has this been happening?" David asked, his voice less sharp than before. "Just a few times," Carmen admitted. "When the regular nurse had to leave early, or when Lily seemed especially quiet. Mrs. Chen knows I've been spending extra time with her, but I never told her about the dancing." "I was afraid," she trailed off. "Afraid of what?" "Afraid you would stop me, and Lily would go back to being sad all the time." The honesty in Carmen's voice cut through David's remaining anger. He realized that this woman had been caring for his daughter not because it was her job, but because she genuinely cared about Lily's happiness. And somehow, in just a few short sessions, she'd managed to reach parts of his daughter that had been locked away since his wife's death. "The decorations," David said, looking around the room again. "Where did they come from?" "I made them at home," Carmen said quietly. "The flowers, the ribbons. I thought they might make the room feel more like a place where a little girl lives instead of..." She didn't finish the sentence, but David knew what she meant. "Instead of a hospital room." For the first time since entering the room, David really looked at the changes Carmen had made. The paper flowers were clearly handmade, each one slightly different but crafted with obvious care. The colorful fabric hanging from the ceiling moved gently in the air circulation, creating patterns of light and shadow that were almost hypnotic. Even the small plants on the windowsill looked healthy and well-tended. Someone had put love into this room. "Real genuine love. Lily," David said softly, turning to his daughter. "Do you like dancing with Carmen?" His daughter's response was immediate and unmistakable. Her face lit up and she made an excited sound while moving her hands in what was clearly meant to be clapping. It was the most animated response he'd gotten from her in years. David felt something crack open in his chest, a wall he'd built around his heart to protect himself from the pain of not knowing how to help his daughter. For 3 years, he'd focused on providing for her medical needs while ignoring something much more basic, her need to be a happy child. "I'm sorry," he said, though he wasn't entirely sure if he was apologizing to Carmen or to Lily or to himself. I want to do right by her. I want to give her everything she needs." Carmen's smile was understanding and kind. "You are a good father, Mr. Thompson. But maybe what Lily needs most is for you to see her the way I see her. Not as someone who needs to be fixed, but as someone who needs to be loved." David stood in his daughter's transformed room for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. The weight of Carmen's words settled over him like a blanket he'd been missing without knowing it. Not as someone who needs to be fixed, but as someone who needs to be loved. How had he gotten so far away from something so simple? "Carmen," he said finally, his voice much quieter than it had been before. "Would you mind if I watched? I mean, would you show me what you do with Lily?" Carmen's eyebrows rose in surprise. "You want to see us dance?" "I want to understand," David said, looking at his daughter. "I want to learn how to make her smile like that." Lily made a small sound of excitement as if she understood what was being discussed. Her hands moved slightly and David realized she was trying to clap again. The sight of his daughter's enthusiasm for something so simple made his throat tight with emotion. Carmen's whole face brightened. "Of course, but maybe first you should sit down. Sometimes watching is harder than doing." David pulled up the chair he usually used for their quiet evening reading sessions, positioning it where he could see everything clearly. Carmen moved to the small speaker she'd brought and selected a new song, something gentle and flowing that immediately filled the room with warmth. "We always start slow," Carmen explained, moving to Lily's wheelchair. "Let the music come into our hearts first before we ask our bodies to move." She began by simply taking Lily's hands and swaying slightly in place. David watched his daughter's face change as the music washed over her. Her eyes closed and a small smile played at the corners of her mouth. It was like watching someone wake up from a long sleep. "Feel it, little bird?" Carmen asked softly. "The music wants to carry us somewhere beautiful today." Lily opened her eyes and looked directly at Carmen with such trust and affection that David felt his chest tighten. When was the last time his daughter had looked at him that way? When was the last time anyone had looked at him with such simple, uncomplicated love? Carmen began to help Lily out of her wheelchair, supporting her weight while allowing her feet to touch the ground. "Today we are flowers growing in a garden," she said, her voice taking on the storytelling tone David had heard from the hallway. "The sun is warm on our faces, and we stretch toward the light." As they moved together, Carmen kept up a gentle stream of narration that turned their dance into an adventure. They were flowers, then butterflies, then birds soaring over mountains. Each transformation brought new movements and new expressions of joy from Lily. But David found himself watching Carmen almost as much as his daughter. The way she moved was natural and graceful, but more than that, she was completely present with Lily. There was no checking the clock, no thinking about what came next in the schedule. She was simply there in that moment, sharing something beautiful with a child who needed beauty in her life. "Mr. Thompson," Carmen said without stopping their gentle dance, "would you like to try?" David's first instinct was to refuse. He wasn't a dancer. He was a businessman who moved through the world with purpose and efficiency, not grace and rhythm. But looking at Lily's expectant face, he found himself standing up. "I don't really know how," he admitted. "There is no wrong way," Carmen assured him. "Just feel the music and let it move you." She guided him to stand on Lily's other side, showing him how to support their daughter, while still allowing her the freedom to move. "Don't think so much," Carmen said with a gentle laugh as David tried to analyze the proper technique. "Just be with Lily, let her show you what she needs." At first, David felt awkward and uncertain. His movements were stiff, his timing off. But gradually, as he focused less on doing it right and more on the expression of wonder on his daughter's face, something shifted. The music began to make sense in a way that had nothing to do with rhythm and everything to do with connection. "She's beautiful," he whispered, watching Lily attempt to lift her arms higher as they swayed together. "Yes," Carmen agreed. "She has always been beautiful. You just needed to see her in the light." They danced for the length of 3 songs, and David was amazed at how quickly the time passed. Usually his visits with Lily felt measured and careful, each minute accounted for and filled with specific activities designed to meet therapeutic goals. This felt like no time at all and like forever, both at once. When the music finally stopped, Lily looked more alive than David had seen her since before his wife's death. Her cheeks were flushed with excitement, her eyes bright and alert. As Carmen helped her back into her wheelchair, Lily reached out toward David with both hands. It took him a moment to understand what she wanted, but when he realized she was asking for a hug, David felt tears spring to his eyes. He knelt down beside her wheelchair and pulled her gently into his arms, feeling her small body relax against his chest. "I love you, sweetheart," He whispered into her hair. "I'm sorry it took me so long to figure out how to show you." Over the next few days, David found himself coming home earlier and earlier. He canceled meetings that could be handled by email, delegated projects that didn't absolutely require his personal attention, and discovered that his business somehow continued to function without his constant presence. More importantly, he began to spend real time with Lily, not the careful, scheduled visits that had become their routine, but spontaneous moments of connection. He started joining Carmen's afternoon dance sessions, gradually learning to read his daughter's expressions and respond to her needs in the moment. Carmen, meanwhile, had officially become part of their household. David had spoken with Mrs. Chen about expanding her role from housekeeping to companion care for Lily. The change in their home's atmosphere was immediate and profound. The sterile, hospital-like quiet that had dominated their house for 3 years was replaced by music, laughter, and the sounds of a family learning to live together again. Lily's regular therapists noticed the change too, commenting on her improved muscle tone, better appetite, and increased responsiveness during sessions. But the biggest change was in David himself. He began to see his daughter not as a collection of medical needs and limitations, but as a whole person with preferences, personality, and potential. She loved music with strong rhythms, got excited when Carmen spoke Spanish, and had developed what could only be described as a sense of humor about her father's clumsy attempts at dancing. 3 months after that life-changing afternoon, David sat in Lily's room watching her work with her speech therapist. The room still had all its medical equipment and therapeutic tools, but it also had Carmen's handmade decorations, the plants on the windowsill, and a professional sound system David had installed for their daily dance sessions. "She's made remarkable progress," the therapist was saying. "Whatever changes you've made in her routine, they're working. She's more engaged, more responsive, and her muscle coordination has improved significantly." David smiled, watching his daughter attempt to form words with more enthusiasm than he'd seen in years. "We started dancing," he said simply. That evening, after Carmen had gone home and the house had settled into its peaceful nighttime routine, David sat with Lily for their usual bedtime story. But instead of reading from one of her books, he found himself talking about her mother. "Mom loved to dance too," he told her, watching her face light up with interest. "She used to dance around the kitchen while she cooked, and she tried to teach me her favorite steps. I was terrible at it, but she never laughed at me. Well, not in a mean way." Lily made a soft sound that might have been a question, and David found himself understanding what she was asking without needing words. "Yes, sweetheart. I think she would love seeing us dance together. I think she'd be proud of how brave and strong you are, and how hard you try at everything." As he kissed Lily goodnight and turned off the lights, David realized that for the first time since his wife's death, their house felt like a home again. Not because anything had been fixed or cured, but because they had learned to find joy in the midst of their challenges. The little girl who had been lost in medical routines and therapeutic goals had been found again, not through expensive treatments or professional interventions, but through the simple magic of music, movement, and unconditional love. And the father who had forgotten how to see his daughter's heart had remembered that sometimes the most important thing you can give a child isn't what they need to get better, but what they need to be happy.